Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to create this ice cream cone as a part of my summer series. So I hope that you guys like this one. Let's dive right into it. These are the colors that I'm going to be using: alizarin crimson, raw umber, and yellow ochre. I'm using Arches cold pressed paper, and I've just cut a sheet into little squares. So that is going to be the paper I'm using. I'm just mixing up a little bit of raw umber with yellow ochre right now to kind of make a beigey, tan, more on the yellow side kind of shade. And this is going to be the color for the waffle cone. So to start, I'm using the very tip of my brush, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball where I want the cone to go. The waffle cone shape actually looks like it's wrapped around this sort of shape in the front, and then you're going to have a little piece of the same cone sticking out from the other side. Hopefully that makes sense. So this side is kind of like a triangle shape. It has a slightly rounded top, so one side of the cone is higher than the other side, joined together with a little curved line. And then just using water, I'm dragging that color into the center area. For the other half of the cone, this is the part that's going to look like it's wrapped behind the other side. So I'm just going to draw in a little triangle on this side, and I'm going to fill that in with the same color. I'm going to leave a little bit of a white space between the two sections just to separate them a little bit. And then I'm just going to fill in that area with that color that I mixed up. Taking a little bit of raw umber right now, I'm just darkening some of those areas. So where it starts to wrap around, I want that to look more three-dimensional, more of a cylindrical shape. So I'm adding some of the darker tone to that one side of the cone. I wanted this to be a little bit more splotchy looking of a painting, so I'm just taking clean water and dragging it along the side of the paper beside the cone, and then just really gently touching the tip of my brush to some of that paint to allow it to blend into that watery area. And then I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. I find it easier to just rotate my paper when I do this. And I'm just doing the same thing. So wetting the paper, gently touching some of the paint to that wet area to allow it to bleed out. So this is going to be the first layer of the cone. We are definitely going to add more detail to this. So we're going to let that dry completely. And as that is drying, I'm going to work on the ice cream. I'm using the alizarin crimson for the ice cream. Although it is red, as you know, when you add water to it, it's going to dilute it and turn it into more of a pinky shade. So for the ice cream, if you look at a photo of an ice cream cone, you will notice that there's a lot of different texture within that ice cream. It's not just like a solid, smooth shape. We could very easily do some very solid sphere shapes, but that's not how ice cream generally looks. So by using the very tip of my brush, I'm just going to very carefully go in and sort of map out where those darkest areas are going to go. I'm going to imagine that my ice cream cone has 4 separate scoops of ice cream. So while I do want to imagine that it has these 4 round ice cream scoops, I definitely want to portray them more in a light and dark sort of way by painting on just the dark areas right now and then adding detail later. I definitely recommend for this part, if you're unsure of how ice cream actually looks, pop on over to Google image search and search ice cream cones and just get a feel for kind of what I'm talking about with the different textures, and you'll start to notice the darker little areas that kind of look like little spots and wrinkles and stuff like that within the ice cream. So that's kind of what you want to portray here. So again, I'm just using the tip of my brush. You can kind of see it start to come together now with the outlines, the very rough little outlines that I've started to do on some of these scoops. You can definitely see the rounded shapes a lot better now. And then you can see how I'm just adding in some of the shadows where the ice cream scoops meet. And then once I have those sort of mapped out, I can go in again and very carefully add in a little bit more color, because obviously I don't want this ice cream to be white. It is more of a pink color. I do want to keep some of that white space as highlight, but I do also want to fill in the majority of that area with the pink color. So I've added 3 scoops here. Hopefully you can see them well enough now that I've kind of defined them a little bit better. I thought that it needed a little bit more, something bigger, so I decided to go in with a 4th scoop, and I just added it to the top right here. So again, doing the exact same thing, I'm just adding in little dots and little markings where the darker areas go, and continuing that shadow where each scoop meets. And then to kind of tie the ice cream and the cone together, I'm going to do that same kind of splotchy loose effect on the colored ice cream as well. Then I decided that I wanted to add in a little bit of splatter detail. So I'm just wetting more of the paper so that I can create splatters that bleed a little bit into the background. And then I'll grab some paint on my brush. I'll cover up the cone because I don't want any splatters there. And I'll just add a couple throughout the background. Now I'll let that dry completely before moving on to the next layer. So with this completely dry, you can see that it's starting to come together. We still have a little bit more to go to really pull this whole piece together. So I'm going to start working on the cone, and using raw umber, I'm going to start creating those waffle shapes, that waffle texture to the cone. So what I'm doing here is creating these sort of really loose little squares that are going to line up to one another. And I'm just going to make those darker towards that top right corner, and then a little bit lighter as we get into that more light highlighted area of the cone. And these don't have to be like perfect squares. I'm literally just doing little markings with the tip of my brush, and I'm making sure to create markings along the top edge of this square and the side of the square to kind of create almost like a upside down L shape. That's just going to help make it look like there's a bit of a shadow on each of those squares. And I'm also making sure to follow the curve of that cone. So I'm not going straight from one side to the other. You can see that I'm kind of curving this around. And then as we get towards the bottom of the cone, the markings are going to be a lot smaller. So really we're just giving the indication that this is a waffle cone. Again, this is more of a loose painting, so everything is pretty much implied. It doesn't have to be exact, it doesn't have to be realistic. You just want the viewer to know that that's what it is. This is a waffle cone, and this is the implied texture. So for the other half of the cone up here, you can see that I've rotated the direction because that's generally the direction that the waffle cone would be like folded around in. And I've just done the same thing by creating those sort of upside down L shapes to indicate the shadows of those squares. So now that the ice cream is dry, I can go in and darken some of those shadowy areas a little bit more. So the most shadowy spots are going to be around that edge of the cone. So I'm just taking a nice concentrated mix of the alizarin crimson, and using the tip of my brush, I'm just really roughly making these impressions and markings with my brush and creating those shadow areas. And I am following along with some of the markings that I created previously, just so that I can darken some of them, and then other times I'm going sort of outside of those lines that I had created before, just to add more color to the piece. So again, refer to an ice cream cone image if you can, just to get these shadows right. So once again, I do want to separate these scoops because they do tend to get lost as the paint dries. So I'm just going to darken around some of those edges of each of the scoops to make them pop a little bit more. And then continuing darkening some of those darker areas. And I'm just bringing some of these scoops out a little bit more with the pink because I wanted them to appear a little bit larger. And then again, just defining where the scoops go. I'm just dragging some of that color in towards some of the white areas just to cover those up a little bit more. Again, doing this very loosely and just using the very tip of my brush to kind of push that color around while not covering up the entire white area. I'm going to let that layer dry, and because the cone is dry now, I can go back in and darken some of those areas as well. So I'm just taking raw umber again, and I'm just going to go over some of those square shapes that I created before, just darken them a little bit more and add sort of more of a shadow around the very edges of them to kind of make it appear as though it's got shadows on the indents. And then I'm darkening the one side of the cone here just because I really wanted that to look a little bit more round. So I'm darkening the edge and allowing the center portion to be the lightest area. And then where the second half of the cone overlaps, I'm making sure to leave sort of a little white space around the rim where it overlaps, just so that I can keep that separated. And I'm just using little lines to create that shadow detail on each of these little squares. And then for the other half of the cone, I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm also going to darken around the top here where the ice cream sort of hangs over the cone a little bit because it would naturally be a bit darker there. Now I'm going to add in a little bit of raw umber to my alizarin crimson to create sort of a darker, just a slightly darker red shade that I can go in and add along the edge where the cone meets the ice cream. And then I wanted to sort of bring the cone out a little bit and just sort of make it wrap around that ice cream a little bit more. So I just used the tip of my brush and I kind of just expanded that cone area just a tiny bit. And with that darker area that I created dry on the cone, I can go in over that shadow now and add the darker tone to those little squares, just like I did before. Now I'm going to take some of that red again, and because the ice cream is dry, I can go in again and darken this one more time. So I'm just darkening again around the edge where the cone meets the ice cream. And then I'm going to go in and darken some of the darkest areas once again. Just using the very tip of my brush, I'm sort of dotting on some of those little textured areas and folds and holes and stuff that appear naturally in the ice cream. And I'm also darkening a little bit more around where the ice cream scoops meet each other. Now with raw umber again, I'm just going to darken some of those little squares that I felt needed a little bit more of a shadow. And then once you're happy with your ice cream cone, you're good to go. This is how mine looked. You can add a couple more splatters if you want to as well, but I'm really happy with how this turned out.